This slideshow and lecture will focus on unions, kind of the rise of the unions and what they were like at the beginning of American unions. So as this shift started to happen that we already talked about with the second industrial revolution, and the people were moving from farms into factory work, the life of a worker was not real great. Okay, within these factories, you could see a lot of workers doing very dull, so unexciting and repetitive tasks. So you're doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. The other thing that often was happening was there was a lot of dangerous and unhealthy conditions. There was in a lot of the places the biggest problem was ventilation, so that would be like cleaning of the air and filtering of the air. And so the lint and the dust and the toxic fumes from all of the different things they were making, so lint and dust would be in any factory, lint would be in like a textile factory, toxic fumes could be any factory with chemicals and stuff like that. People were breathing those in. There were also heavy machines like these children are operating here, okay, without a whole lot of safety devices to keep you from, getting your hand stuck, getting your foot stuck, getting something stuck, and, really seriously getting injured. The other thing that was happening at the time is average worker wages were rising. So they were rising by about 50%. So they went up by about 50%. And so, in general, an American worker during this Gilded Age time was getting about 22 cents per hour, and they worked about 59 hours per week. But at the same time as this was happening, deflation was happening in the country. So what deflation is basically deflation is when prices go down. So if prices go down, that means the value of the dollar that you have in your pocket is more. So it's actually deflation is a rise in the value of your money. So if you're making the same amount of money, it is buying you more products. It's worth more money. So what ended up happening is because of this deflation, companies started to cut wages. They were cutting wages and making them smaller at a lower rate than deflation. So really, in effect, it was a raise for these people, but the workers didn't like the lower wages. They didn't like the lower number on their paychecks. And so because of being frustrated by these lower numbers on their paychecks and the wages being cut, they started to want and desire organization. They desired these unions to stand up for workers' rights. So there were two basic type of workers, and we've talked about them before. We've talked about the unskilled laborers and the skilled laborers. And the skilled laborers, also known as craft workers, they had special skills or training. So you might be a welder or a typesetter or a shoemaker or something that took a particular skill that not just anybody can do. And so because you were not easily replaced, and if you quit, they would have to find somebody else with the same skills instead of just anybody that they could train quickly. You made more money and you had more control over your time as well. So you could work less hours if you desired to. You just had more control over what was happening at your job in general. Common laborers, unskilled laborers, they were they were people that did not have these same skills, and so if an unskilled laborer quit, they could literally bring anybody in off the street and replace them and train them very quickly. Those people got lower wages and had less control in general. So of course the first ones to start making unions were the ones that had some control. So they were the craft workers, these skilled laborers. And in the 1830s, craft workers started to form trade unions, and by 1873, there were about 30 national trade unions. Some of the bigger ones were Iron Molders International, International Typographical Union, Knights of St. Crispin, which was a shoemakers union, and these unions started to grow. However, the employers did not like the unions at all. The employers, of course, are not going to like something that's making them let their workers work less and pay their workers more money. They thought of the unions as a group that was getting in the way of one of the most important things in America, which was their property rights. They saw the labor as something they needed as part of their property, and because of that, um, oppose the union. They thought the union was taking away something that was guaranteed to them by the Constitution. And those businesses and employers, they really particularly hated one type of union, an industrial union. So an industrial union was simply a union that united all of the workers in a particular industry. So all of the workers that do a specific job, like let's say all of the people that are skilled and make shoes, or all of the people that are skilled and are welders or pipe fitters or something like that. Because if they really did work together, then they had all of the power against the employer, because the employer needs those people, and it would take a very long time to train new people into that skill. So the united all of the workers in the industry, the business leaders hated that. And so they had to find different ways to fight the unions. And so first off, they made their workers, when they came in, they said, okay, you want a job here? It's a good paying job, all that kind of stuff. You have to sign an oath to not join a union ever, to be part of this company. And so you had many people do that. Also, the people that were organizing the unions often got in trouble, because what would happen is the businesses would hire detectives to find out who it was that was organizing the union and who was starting it, and then they would fire that person, whoever was talking about unionization, and they would often blacklist them. So they would basically communicate with all the other companies and say, this guy's a troublemaker, he's making unions and stuff like that, and you need to not hire him. And so no one would hire him on, and then he couldn't make a union because he wasn't working in that field anymore. The employers could also do something called a lockout. A lockout would just be saying, you can't work, we're shutting down the business, we're going to lock you out, and we are not going to allow any union people to come in and work and make money for their families. So completely locking them out. The other thing they would do is they would oftentimes find strikebreakers, people that had the skill or that could work, that were willing to come in and work. And so they'd say, fine, we'll just, if you have this problem, we're going to hire these other people. And there were often people that would sign up to be strikebreakers and do that. A lot of the unions, when it came down to the law of it, were broken up. And the reason they were broken up is because judges would find against them, because there were no laws that protected or allowed workers to create unions. And so oftentimes these unions would be shut down and called, as I quote, conspiracies in the restraint of trade, and the leaders would end up being fined or put in jail even, for their part in creating the union. Take a moment to write out your answer to checkpoint number 1. The other thing that unions had to battle in America was the idea that they were un-American. I mean, one of the biggest things in America is protecting property rights, and so that really made an argument against them. But if we look at it, some of the ideas that were floating around the world at this point, the ideas of Karl Marx, known as Marxism, had become really influential and been moving around Europe. And the belief of Karl Marx was that workers would eventually revolt, and they would overthrow the factories and the government. So they'd overthrow the rich people, they'd overthrow the government, and it would leave a communist society. And a communist society is a society where class doesn't exist, so everybody owns everything, and nobody is better off, nobody is richer than anybody else. We all just kind of share all of our resources. Now, a lot of labor supporters agreed with this, but there were a few of them, and Marx in particular was kind of one of them, who supported anarchism. Okay, and anarchism is this idea that we don't need government at all, and so we basically want to have no government. We just want to move through life without government. And so what was happening across Europe is anarchists were starting to do attacks. There'd be shootings or bombs or things like that to create instability in governments and in businesses that would hopefully start to create that revolution that Marx had talked about. And at the same time as this is happening in Europe, a lot of immigrants were coming in. And really already in America, the anti-immigrant feelings were strong. They didn't like the immigrants. They didn't like the new people. They weren't like them. They just didn't, there was nothing good about them in their opinion. And so the immigrants were associated with these radical ideas like anarchism, like Marxism, and a lot of people became suspicious of the unions as if they were these anarchist tools being run by immigrants, basically. All right, the unions were struggling back and fighting back, and oftentimes they were seen as very, very violent and out of control because of some of the things that happened within their union struggles. And so a lot of the confrontations with the owners often led to violence, sometimes and not at their fault, but we'll kind of see what happened here. One example is the Great Railroad Strike. The Great Railroad Strike, what happened is the Panic of 1873 was this big recession that came in and hurt the American economy, forced a lot of the companies to cut wages. And so what ended up happening is the railroad workers' wages were cut 3 times in a very short period. And so the workers decided, you know what, we're going to unionize and we're going to walk off the job, and not only walk off the job, but block the tracks. And so 80,000 railroad workers left the job, and some of them were so angry they destroyed equipment and tore up the tracks and did all that kind of stuff. And so with this happening, it was really, really important to keep those railroads moving for the country to keep growing. And so state militias were called in, and literally gun battles were happening in some of these areas, and people were dying and being hurt. And so eventually, with it being completely out of control, President Hayes called a state of insurrection, and he sent in federal troops. 12 days later, it took 12 days with federal troops, with the army there, and order was finally restored. But over the course of this strike, about 100 people died, and over $10 million in railroad property was damaged or destroyed. Another union that suffered from some of this perceptions of violence was the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor were one of the really powerful unions at the beginning of unions in the country in 1869. Their leader was a man named Terence Powderly. And Terence Powderly and the Knights of Labor were generally against strikes. They didn't want strikes, but they did believe in boycotts, which meant, not purchasing products from them, not being part of that business. And they also believed in something called arbitration. Arbitration is basically where a third party, somebody else, comes in that's not attached to the workers and not attached to the employers, and helps the workers and the companies come to a settlement and figure it out. The Knights of Labor were interesting because, unlike many others, they became big because they welcomed all people. They welcomed women, they welcomed African Americans, whereas a lot of the other unions were only welcoming in white men. But at this time, they were calling for change. They wanted things to change quickly. They wanted to implement an 8-hour workday, so you wouldn't be working any longer than 8 hours on a given day. They wanted equal pay for women. They wanted to eliminate child labor, so children were not working anymore. And they wanted the factories to be owned by workers. They wanted workers to have some stake in what was happening in the factory and have some decision making. And so one of the reasons that the Knights of Labor kind of fell out of power was the Haymarket Riot. The Haymarket Riot happened when the 8-hour workday supporters called for this nationwide strike, okay? And so a lot of people, including the Knights of Labor people, were involved in this. And they called for a nationwide strike, and about 3,000 people went to protest in Haymarket Square in Chicago, a very famous kind of park area. And what ended up happening is, while this was happening, the police came in, and someone threw a bomb at the police, or someone threw a bomb, period. We're not sure exactly how it happened, and a firefight started. About 170 people were injured, and 10 police ended up being killed. And again, now the union critics had ammunition to use. They saw the unions as dangerous radicals, and they said that these dangerous radical people are the ones that are running the unions and getting everyone all whipped up and everything like that. Okay, and so it gave a very negative connotation on the unions. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint number 2. There were a couple more strikes that we're going to talk about here that turned out bad. First off, the Homestead strike. This happened at actually a Carnegie factory. So an anti-union manager by the name of Henry Clay Frick from a Carnegie factory wanted to cut wages by like 20%. And so what he did is, since he was anti-union and he wanted to do this and the workers were upset, he locked out the workers so he wouldn't let them come in to work. And he had the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which was kind of this big time for hire detective agency, almost like mercenaries at the time, bring in some replacements. And the strikers fought them, wouldn't let them come in, and fought them for about 14 hours. Many different people were injured and dead, and eventually the Pennsylvania governor sent in militia to protect these strike breakers. So again, this idea that the unions are violent comes from kind of these strikes. The Pullman strike was another big strike where the Pullman Palace Car Company, what they did is they cut their wages, but they didn't lower rents or prices in their company town. So a company town is basically, I am going to work for this company, and so they are going to allow me to live in their worker housing and shop from their worker store and all that kind of stuff. And so they took away money from these people, but what they did is they didn't ever or they didn't make the prices lower at the stores or the rent lower or anything like that. So people were outraged. And so what ended up happening is the union workers said, we won't move any Pullman cars. So anybody who was on the railroad and was a railroad unit worker said, no, we're not going to move any cars that are Pullman. And so what ended up happening is the railroad was shut down. These Pullman cars were completely, they were blacklisted. They were shut down. And so what ended up happening is the railroad managers got smart and they started to hook up the U.S. mail to Pullman cars, and no matter what, the U.S. mail has to keep running. And so the President Cleveland sent in troops to say, we need to keep the U.S. mail running. It's very important. So he sent in these troops to keep it running, and a federal court actually issued something called an injunction to end the strike. And an injunction is just a court order that requires someone to either do something or stop doing something. So they basically require them to stop the strike. And this injunction, because this precedent was shown here of it being used in strike situations, it became a very powerful tool for many other judges to use to kind of shut down strikes in the future. So one of the bigger unions that was created at the time was the AFL, or the American Federation of Labor. This man right here, Samuel Gompers, was the president. He was one of the original presidents, and he was president for about 40 years. He held on to that position. And what happened here in the American Federation of Labor is a bunch of these different skilled trade unions came together, combined into this huge union that had a lot of power. And their unionization was pure and simple. They didn't want anything to do with politics. They wanted to avoid the politics of it, and they just wanted to focus on three things: wages, working hours, and conditions. And the three goals that they had for their union was to, number one, recognize unions and agree to collective bargaining. So that basically means that the companies need to say, okay, unions are legit and we're willing to negotiate with them. Second off, they wanted closed shops. A closed shop is a company that will only hire union members. And then third, they wanted 8-hour workdays. Now, the AFL was a pretty exclusive club at this point. Later, it would combine with another and become a little bit easier to get into, but at this point, it was mostly just skilled workers and white men that were allowed to be a part of it. There definitely were some radicals in this time that believed in that Marxism and that anarchism and all that kind of stuff. And some of the more radical people created this IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. This was a labor union created by radicals in 1905. And the goal of it was to organize all workers in the world by industry. So they wanted to organize everybody completely. And what they basically thought was that working class and employing class people, this is a quote from them, have absolutely nothing in common. So the rich people that are running the businesses and the workers have nothing in common. And so what their goal was to make sure everyone is included in the union, including these unskilled workers. And so They kind of tried to bring these people together, and in 1912 they had a successful strike. About 25,000 textile workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and the company ended up reversing the wage cuts that they had done after 10 weeks of striking, so it was successful. However, a lot of the strikes and radical ideas that they were doing, because they endorsed striking and all that kind of stuff, kept the membership pretty small, and therefore it kept the power pretty small in the IWW. There were, of course, women working also, and eventually they wanted to join the unions at all. But by about 1900, women made up about 18% of the workforce. About a third of them were domestic servants, so they worked within other people's households, rich people's households, and did household duties for them, whether it was nannying or doing the laundry or cleaning or cooking, whatever it was. About a third of them were teachers, nurses, and sales clerks, and about a third of them were in factories, mostly food processing and garments, so garments like clothing factories. And so women made less than men. But the reason women made less than men, they said, was because they had a man to support them. Women should have a man to support them, and so they should get paid less. And men should get paid more because they have to support their family. And so that was the idea that was going around, and the reason that women were being paid less at the time. Mary Harris Jones was one of the first female labor organizers. That's her right there. She was a labor organizer known as Mother Jones that worked with the Knights of Labor and organized a lot of mine workers, and she worked for women's rights as well as for all workers' rights as she was working through her career as a union organizer. A couple of unions that women were involved in that were pretty important were, first off, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. This was not just a women's union. This is a union for female and male workers that were essentially working in the ladies' garment, so working in making women's clothes. And they did have a successful strike to gain recognition, and they started to gain better wages. They started to gain benefits for people that were in the industry of making women's clothes. Another union that the women had was the Women's Trade Union League. This is a union exclusively for women that sought a lot of the same things as the other unions: the 8-hour workday, the better benefits, all that kind of stuff, better pay and everything like that. So this was just one of the first women-only unions. Write out 3 questions you have from the notes so far. If you don't have any questions, then just write 3 test questions you might see on a quiz or a test from the material.